Do you need more details on a small town for an adventure you plan to run? Whether you're playing in a published setting or building your own fantasy world, sometimes you need to either create a small town or add details to an existing one. Today I'll talk about 4 steps to creating memorable and fun small towns for your players.
Cool nerd Mark.
I grew up in Texas and I lived in small towns like Moody, Llano, and Sweeney. I understand what it's like to live in a place where everyone knows your name and where everybody in town notices when you get a haircut or a new pair of shoes, and where it's not easy to find something to do on a Saturday night, except maybe D&D. When I wrote my book, Strange Tales for Small Towns, I drew on my experiences living in small towns to create a setting for weird things to happen. Today I'm going to share with you the 4 P's of building small towns in your game: places, products, people, and problems. Think of these as 4 steps that will help you to prepare to run games in a small town that feels real and down home. The first P is places. Begin by thinking of 5 to 10 places you want your small town to have. When I'm designing a small town, sometimes I start by finding a map. There are a ton of small town maps you can find online for free or cheap through sites such as 2 Minute Tabletop, Chepeku, Drive-Thru-RPG, and even on Reddit. I'll put some links to some of those in the description. Look for a map with 5 to 10 interesting buildings that have features that go with the geography of the region where you want your small town. For example, if your town is next to the ocean, you might search for Seaside D&D Town. The other approach is to think about what kind of town you want and draw or design a map. I like to start by drawing the map on paper. Hex paper, graph paper, even plain paper will do. Then if you want, you can find a website like Dungeon Scrawl or Incarnate. There's really a lot of them out there. And make a map that's a little more visually appealing, but it's really not necessary. I ran a small town campaign that lasted 3 years using a map I drew freehand on a piece of poster board. And I'm a terrible artist, but my players didn't care. An interesting small town should have at least 2 interesting terrain features and at least 5 interesting buildings. When you think about memorable small towns, is there a statue, a park, or a landmark that stands out? My parents lived in Wichita Falls, Texas for several years, and when I went to visit them, they took me to the world's shortest skyscraper and the artificial Wichita Falls Waterfall Park. This is a modern day example, but your small town should have a couple of interesting natural or manufactured points of interest. These can add realism to your town and even be adventure hooks. In the small town of Stone Hollow, I'll talk about later, the town is built around a fountain, and that fountain is a central feature that becomes the basis for the adventure Smash that I wrote. Small towns should have little features like that to make them memorable. The second P is products. Towns need an economy to survive. While some small towns can be self-sustaining, towns grow through trade. That means they should have something valuable to export, and they will likely need to import some goods that they don't produce locally. For example, a farming town is going to need metal tools, and it's likely they don't also have an iron mine. It's also likely that a mining town up in the hills will need to import some crops from a farm town in the valley below. Deciding what your town exports and imports can also help to shape the character of the town and determine what kind of people live there. Next, and most importantly, a small town needs interesting people. You won't detail every person who lives in a small town, but you will want to detail certain kinds of people. The first kind I like to call resources. These are people your PCs will need in order to accomplish their adventuring goals. This could include armor and weaponsmiths, an owner of a general store, a bartender who knows rumors of adventure, or a high priest who can help provide healing services. In order to access these resources, the PCs must locate and talk to these resource characters, and this is an opportunity for roleplay and challenges. Not every character who can provide a resource should be easy to deal with. These characters should have their own goals, agendas, personality quirks, and they may be aligned with or in opposition to the goals of the party. If a small town is a setting for your adventure or is the launching point for adventure, other NPCs will be cast members. These can also be resource NPCs, but a cast member is part of the plot of the adventure. They can be an ally, a quest giver, a witness, an informant, a rival, or an enemy of the party. It's possible they could be more than one of these things, depending on the PC's choices. Another note on NPCs, and I could do a whole episode on that. Spend an amount of time developing each NPC that is proportional to how central that NPC is to the story. For most NPCs, a quick note that includes their name, one physical feature, 2 personality traits, and 1 goal or secret is enough. For your player's imagination will fill in the rest. For cast members, you may want to expand that information to a paragraph that includes things like a stat block, though often I will just use one of the pre-made stat blocks in the monster manual or the D&D basic rules, since it's more likely that you'll need them for skill checks or saving throws than having to run a fight against your local NPCs. Remember, it's not necessary to detail every single person in a small town. It's not likely the PCs will interact with that many NPCs, and if you make too many, they won't remember them. I try to keep my NPCs in a small town to 3 to 5 cast members and 3 to 5 resources. The difference in the two is that interacting with cast members is central to the plot of the adventure, and interacting with resource characters is helpful, but not necessary for success. The 4th P is problems. Real towns have problems, and your fantasy town should too. The 2 kinds of problems you want to include are conflicts and hooks. Conflicts are there to give your setting some realism. Not everyone in a small town is going to get along. You may note a rivalry between 2 innkeepers or 2 farmers, or a secret affair the blacksmith is having with the jeweler. Or maybe the local alchemist is secretly part of a cult of the demon lord of oozes. These kinds of things may or may not turn into adventures, but they make your town feel like a place where people don't simply live happily ever after, but they have real problems. Conflicts can be at the community level also, such as drought and economic recession, or bandit raids that close off trade on local roads. Some of these kinds of conflicts, if they could be solved by your players, and it would make for an interesting adventure, can then become a hook. Just know that if you put a hook in your town, your players may choose to follow it, and you need to be prepared to make that your adventure. This is fine if you're running an open concept, sandbox style adventure. In that case, you can provide multiple hooks and just let the players choose which one they want to take. This is great because it gives the players a real sense of agency, but it may not suit the style of every campaign. If your campaign is more linear, then you just provide 1 hook. And if the players don't take it, there's no adventure. This is more the style I recommend for new DMs or for DMs who just don't have a lot of time to design adventures that potentially the players won't go on. In both types of campaigns, you're going to need some hooks if you want to guide your players towards the content that you've written. I think most players are aware of this and will take the hook, or at least one of a range of hooks that you provide, because they want to play the adventure that you've written. So I'd like to share an example of a small town that I designed so I can show what the end product of my process can look like. Stone Hollow is a small mountain town I created for the final adventure of Strange Tales from Small Towns, a D&D 5.5e adventure that I wrote. I want to talk about this small town and how I used the 4 Ps to design it. However, to be honest, I came up with the 4 Ps after I created this town, but that was just me giving a name to a process I was already doing, and maybe some of you are doing all those things too before watching this video. In that case, thanks for still watching. First P, places. Stone Hollow is at the foothills of a mountain chain and near the source of a massive river that flows south for 100 miles from here down to the ocean. There are mines nearby and lots of tall trees. I decided with the timber nearby, the town would be surrounded by a palisade or a wall of logs, and would have at its center a fountain with a statue of Mirana, the Lady of the Waters, and next to that fountain would be a large temple for her. I thought this worked because the city is the source of a large river and would hold that spring sacred. I also downloaded this map from DriveThruRPG, and looking at the buildings in the town, I noticed what looks like a castle and a fort. I decided that this town was once a military base during a time that humans had an uneasy relationship with the dwarves who lived in and under the mountains, but that in the last 60 years, the border had all but dissolved to the point that the current mayor of the town is the daughter of dwarven immigrants. So the castle remains the seat of government for the town, but there are very little troops still stationed there, and the old fort now has become the Old Fort Inn, where people can rent rooms in what used to be the old barracks. The second P, products. The location of the town points to 3 products: mining, timber, and crafts. Since I wanted to have a blacksmith in town, I'll say that the mines produce iron, and somewhere outside of town is a factory that processes the ore and refines some of that into steel. This gives the blacksmith raw materials to produce and sell goods in town, and also to export goods down the river, especially farming tools. Loggers also cut down trees to send on ships down to the capital for shipbuilding, and the town also has a few skilled crafters whose shops are visited by tourists who come up to spend time in the beautiful mountains surrounding. The third P, people. So you can see that I have a few labels on this map. While I don't want to get into all of them in this video, I'll just say I spent some time detailing 2 priests in the water temple, the owners of the Old Fort Inn and the Wiener House, and the blacksmith and his daughter. When I wrote the Wiener House, I was actually inspired by a mountain town here in Washington State, Leavenworth. There's something about that experience of having hot dogs and a cold brew while surrounded by mountains and forests that just makes me want to go on an adventure or take a nap. All right, the fourth P, problems. Since this adventure was more linear and not a sandbox, I kept it to 1 conflict and 1 hook. The obvious conflict is there are 2 different places to eat in town. I decided this was a mostly resolved conflict, as the Wiener House specializes in lunch and dinner, and the Old Fort on breakfast. But the two owners don't like each other, and one might talk smack about the other one if the place is mentioned. I thought about the rivalry in Bob's Burgers between Bob and Jimmy Pesto, the owner of the fancy Italian restaurant next door, and this kind of inspired me to write about a conflict between 2 restaurant owners. For my hook, there is a chemical that gets dumped into the water supply by a local alchemist that's causing mutations in animals and now people. The adventure will then be an investigation where the PCs can talk to each of these different NPCs in town, each of which has a bit of helpful knowledge or resources, before they ultimately will travel under the fountain to find the suspect and solve the town's problem. Well, that's it for my episode on small towns. Hope you enjoyed that. Next week, we'll move on to talk about city adventures. Hey, if you like this content, please give this video a like, and if you find this kind of content helpful, consider subscribing to keep getting my weekly D&D videos, and to maybe even see my little monster song videos too. You can also check out my website, coolnerdmark.com, where you'll find nerdy music, more videos, and D&D adventure books for sale like the one I talked about today. Thanks for watching, and hope to adventure with you soon.
Carrion crawler. You got too many tentacles for me. You paralyze me with your touch. Your number of legs is way too much. When a carrion crawler comes calling, I'm going to